So Aaron, in the US, for more than 103 years, it has been established that freedom of trade includes the right to refuse to deal with others, especially with rivals. The control over access to market that some digital intermediaries have popularized the proposal to impose duties to deal, revive the essential facilities doctrine, and treat digital platforms as public utilities. What economic conditions, if any, might support the imposition of duties to deal? And do you think that these are the economic conditions that we currently face? Aaron, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Oren, for the introduction and the question. That's an extremely tough question, and I will give you today's answer with the caveat that if you catch me on a different day, you'll get a different answer. But let me say a few things in an effort to start a conversation and try out a position rather than to create the definitive word. The first thing is I want to quibble with the premise and remind everyone that I agree certainly that for 100 years, US firms have been free to refuse to deal with others, especially rivals. But this is only true except when it isn't or wasn't. So the freedom ends or ended in a terminal railroad case when a railroad bridge had to be shared, or Associated Press when we found no firm could blackball competitors to prevent them from joining a news pooling cooperative, or Otter Tail, which mandated wheeling of power to a competing retailer, or Aspen, which prevented a ski company from cutting off interconnection when previously granted. And those cases may have created an essential facilities doctrine, but as students of US law know, those have, while not been overruled, probably obliterated in practice or prediction by a combination of comments in Trinco and recent Supreme Court appointments. So my take is that those are entirely dead in the United States unless we have new legislative proposals that resuscitate them. Such as the Klobuchar bill attempts to do, and several others in various ways. So you ask me, well, if we forget about current US antitrust law and think with a clean slate, what economic conditions warrant imposing a duty to deal? And I guess I would start by stepping into a time machine and considering an old Seventh Circuit case from 1983, which is the holding in MCI versus AT&T. And that might be a good start, where they say the conditions for a duty to deal are control of an essential facility by a monopoly and inability to practically or reasonably duplicate the facility and feasibility of providing access. Now, I think you need to add to that list from the case, and maybe it was implicit in the case, that access is reasonably necessary for rivals to compete, and they will increase competition without unduly limiting incentives to create or improve the facility. Now, if you want to impose a duty to deal, and as I sit here today, I'm more skeptical than maybe I will be tomorrow or would have been yesterday. And Herb's talk made me less skeptical too than when I wrote these notes. But as I sit here today, or at least last night, I want to point out that you'll also need to confront, if you want to impose that duty, abundant practical problems that include deciding the price and the type of access and monitoring compliance. Saying interoperability is much easier than achieving it. And that's particularly true in these fast-moving digital markets where we have constant software updates. I'm certain my firm could never have been started if you'd imposed interoperability on us. Now, maybe no one would have until we were big. But then my question is, well, will you stop firms from proceeding if you do that? So I am extremely worried about persistent monopoly today. But the problems in mandating access overwhelm me and give me some pause. So I'm tempted to say the answer is regulation, not antitrust. And probably that's the better answer of the two. But that said, do I think regulators are great at solving access problems? I don't. Their incapacity to do it is how we got Trinco. That being said, I can pick up my phone on Verizon and dial anyone in the United States, and that's pretty cool. So regulation isn't impossible. Now let me give you one contemporary example of an access issue, which is Microsoft and the DOJ both claim Google has a huge scale advantage in data for search and ads. Google's paying to acquire searches as inputs, paying Apple among others, which appears to be competition on the merits. Maybe the firm paying the most gets the searches. But the DOJ sees this as monopolizing data and leaving Bing and rivals perpetually weak. In an alternative regime, maybe one we will see, you could bring a case in which the DOJ sued Google to open up all its data. Well, would that be a good thing? Certainly, it would be a good thing if that were costless and didn't impair their incentives to create, maintain, and organize the data. But those are real problems that must be taken into account. And today, maybe not yesterday or tomorrow, but today I fear the mess of mandating access and determining what access means, what kind of access you'll provide. And I fear that more than I fear the monopolies of essential facilities. Try me a different day, as I say at the beginning, and you might hear a different answer. To say there's a duty to deal begs the question of price and what kind of dealing is required. And that gets into the preferencing issues that Carl's going to discuss. I could try to avoid the whole regulatory mess by demanding that the essential facility be a standalone business and hope it deals with everyone rather than mimicking vertical integration with restrictive contracts. But that gets into the questions that Nancy will address, which are the proposals on the table to mandate structural separations.
Thanks. Okay. Anyone else want to address this issue?
Let me just jump in and with a general observation, which is when you ask academics about things, they just tell you the problems. They don't, and so what we heard from Aaron was a list of problems. Antitrust doesn't work. Well, regulation wouldn't work either, but there's these big digital platforms that are causing problems. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of problems. So at some point you have to pick what you think is the least bad approach, and listing off all the things that are wrong with the approach that is least bad doesn't maybe help the 180 people that are listening to us right now, hoping for some guidance as to where to go. I could tell you all the things that are wrong with anything you give me, right? I get paid to do that. It's easy. But what's really hard is deciding what we should do, regardless of the fact that, of course, the best path will be flawed.
Well, in an attempt to be slightly more constructive then, it seems to me one way to think about this is if you mandate access over the objections of the owner of the facility or platform, whatever, usually, at least in the US, we get this furious response of, oh, you're going to undermine the incentive to invest and entrepreneur build things and so forth. And it seems to me that's pretty amenable to economic analysis in the sense that if we think of chopping off the very upper tail of a distribution for some companies that have made enormous profits, and suppose you told everybody that's the rule, right? You know, if you get a gazillion% rate of return and you've got a durable dominant position, you should be ready in that case too. You're going to have to give up some stuff. I don't think there's much evidence to think that would reduce investment. On the other hand, we would think access would enable a bunch of, you know, subsequent entrepreneurs building on the platform. So I think that argument is pretty weak, and we can try to simplify the analysis. If we're talking about access to selected companies that really do have, you know, dominant, durable, powerful positions. Now that's not to answer the question about administrative complexities, but it's trying to narrow the debate and talk about what's practical then, rather than get hung up on, you know, property rights as the end of the discussion.
So I think it might be useful to, in all sympathy for Fiona's, academics are always listing off problems. I don't actually think that's empirically correct. There are plenty of academics who have been very involved in market design and regulatory design, not listing off reasons why you can't do it, but listing off things that you have to consider to do it well. But maybe it's helpful to sort of lay out, since it seems as though we're going to walk through a kind of large number of potential solutions to some of the problems that have been identified. Maybe we should walk through those and then circle back to answer what I think is at the heart of Fiona's question, and to some extent Carl's response. And I hear even a bit of with Aaron is, if we've got a menu of options, which ones seem most likely to move us in the direction that we'd like to go? And in particular, as someone who studied economic regulation for most of my career, unintended consequences of regulation are a significant cost of regulatory activity. And I think it's useful to identify concerns, because as Carl started by saying, if you're going to mandate something over the objections of firms, or I would just say, if you're going to mandate something without changing the incentives of firms, we're likely to see, we could think of it as either evasionary conduct or conduct to protect whatever rents firms had before the regulation. And I think it's just helpful to get a sense of where we think those opportunities are most significantly likely to lead to unintended consequences.